I was forced to be a live-in nanny for my ungrateful daughter. The moment I got sick and couldn't babysit, she threw my medicine in the trash and said, "If you can't work, you can't stay." A week later, her husband called me begging, after I exposed their fraudulent disability claims to the government. Before we continue, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. My name is Patricia Evans. For 40 years I was a home health aide, a professional caregiver who knew the precise, delicate balance of compassion and strength. I believed my life's final chapter would be one of quiet, earned rest. This is the story of how my own daughter turned my retirement into a prison of unpaid labor, and how I used the last of my strength to write a final prescription for a potent and legally binding dose of accountability. Now let me tell you my story. My world had shrunk to the size of a 3-bedroom Baltimore row house, but my workday was 24 hours long. At 64, my retirement was a cruel fiction, a word that had no meaning in the relentless, grinding reality of my daily life. I was the unseen cog in the dysfunctional, fraudulent machine of my daughter's household. A silent, unpaid employee whose only compensation was a lumpy mattress in a damp, windowless basement. My day began at 5:30, long before the sun had a chance to cast its gray, watery light over the city. I would rise in the cold, subterranean darkness, my old bones protesting, and tiptoe up the creaking stairs to the main floor. The first task was always the same: to prepare the house for the waking of its 2 professional invalids, my daughter Kimberly and her husband Jason. I would make the coffee, unload the dishwasher, and pack the lunches for my 2 real reasons for being there. My grandchildren, Aiden and Chloe, they were my heart, my twin sons in a world of perpetual twilight. At 7 and 4 they were beautiful, boisterous, and utterly dependent on the grandmother who was, for all intents and purposes, their primary caregiver. Kimberly, my daughter, would usually emerge from her bedroom around 9, her movements a slow, theatrical performance of agonizing pain. She was, according to the state of Maryland, on long-term disability for a constellation of vague, untestable ailments: chronic fibromyalgia, debilitating back pain, and a litany of other fashionable maladies she had gleaned from late-night television commercials. She would groan as she lowered herself onto the sofa, a heating pad permanently affixed to her lower back, her face a mask of tragic, long-suffering agony. "Morning, Mom," she would moan, her voice a weak, breathy thing. "My pain levels are at a 9 today. I don't think I'll be able to move from this spot." She would then spend the rest of the day on that spot, her thumb a blur as she scrolled through social media, her face illuminated by the cold blue light of her phone, a modern-day invalid in a kingdom of her own fraudulent creation. Jason, her husband, was a participant in his own separate but equal grift. He was, according to the federal government, on permanent disability for a work-related injury he had sustained as a roofer several years prior. He would limp through the house in the morning, his face a mask of pained stoicism, before miraculously recovering just enough to get into his pickup truck and drive off to his under-the-table construction jobs. His lunchbox, which I had packed on the seat beside him. They were a perfectly matched pair of parasites, 2 able-bodied adults who had discovered that it was easier to perform illness than it was to perform work. And I was the engine that made their lazy, duplicitous lives possible. From the moment the children's feet hit the floor, I was in motion. I dressed them, I fed them, I brushed their teeth. I walked Aiden to the bus stop for school, Chloe's small trusting hand in mine. I spent my days with Chloe, reading her stories, taking her to the park, navigating the endless, exhausting, and beautiful landscape of a 4-year-old's world. I did the grocery shopping, I did the laundry, I did the cooking. I was the nanny, the housekeeper, the chef, the laundress, and my payment was the roof over my head, a roof that I knew, with a quiet, soul-crushing certainty, was being paid for by the very taxpayers I had been my entire working life. My only moments of true, uncomplicated joy were with the children. It was in the way Chloe would bury her face in my neck, her soft, baby-fine hair smelling of sunshine and shampoo. It was in the way Aiden would proudly show me his schoolwork, his eyes shining with a need for an approval he rarely received from his own parents. Their love was the fuel that kept me going, the single beautiful reason I endured the daily grinding humiliation of my existence. I was not a grandmother, living with her family. I was a live-in servant, and my grandchildren were my beautiful, beloved, and utterly blameless jailers. The first sign of the coming storm was a familiar, dreaded ache in my chest. A deep, resonant pain that I knew from a lifetime of experience was the prelude to a serious respiratory infection. As a retired home health aide, I was intimately acquainted with the landscape of my own body, and I knew with a grim certainty that I was getting sick. The ache soon blossomed into a deep rattling cough, a dry hacking sound that echoed in the quiet of my basement room at night. I knew what I needed. I needed rest. I needed antibiotics. I needed to allow my 64-year-old body the time and the resources to fight off the infection that was taking root in my lungs. But in the fragile, carefully balanced ecosystem of my daughter's household, there was no room for me to be sick. My health was not a personal matter, it was a logistical crisis. If I could not work, the entire fraudulent enterprise would grind to a halt. Who would watch the children? Who would make the meals? Who would do the laundry? The two professional invalids upstairs were certainly not going to do it. For 2 days I tried to push through it. I dosed myself with over-the-counter cold medicine, I drank endless cups of hot tea with honey, and I tried to pretend that the growing weakness in my limbs and the escalating fever in my blood were just a figment of my imagination, that the infection was a relentless, indifferent foe. By the 3rd day the cough had become a constant, racking thing, each spasm sending a shower of sharp, stabbing pains through my chest. I was dizzy, my head a thick, foggy cloud of fever, and my breath was coming in short, shallow gasps. I knew I couldn't put it off any longer. I needed to see a doctor. I needed a prescription for antibiotics before this bronchitis, as I had self-diagnosed it, turned into a full-blown, life-threatening case of pneumonia. The thought of asking Kimberly for help was a humiliation in itself. To ask her to care for her own children, for a single afternoon, felt like a plea for a favor of almost unimaginable proportions. But I had no choice. I waited until Jason had left for his under-the-table job, his limp miraculously vanishing as he walked down the front steps, and I gathered my courage. I went upstairs, my hand trailing along the banister for support, my breath a ragged whistling sound in my own ears. I found Kim exactly where I knew she would be. On the sofa, wrapped in a plush throw blanket, her phone held inches from her face, her thumb a blur of mindless scrolling. The television was on, a talk show blaring to an empty room. She didn't even look up when I entered. "Kimberly," I began, my voice a hoarse, unfamiliar croak. She sighed, a long-suffering sound of pure unadulterated annoyance, and slowly, reluctantly, lowered her phone. "What is it, Mom?" she asked, her voice a flat, bored monotone. "I'm not feeling well, dear," I said, the words punctuated by a deep rattling cough that sent a fresh wave of pain through my chest. I think I have bronchitis. I need to go to the walk-in clinic. I was wondering if you could possibly watch the children for me, just for a few hours this afternoon." The look on her face was a masterpiece of theatrical agony. She let out a low, pained groan, her hand flying to her lower back as if she had just been struck by a bolt of lightning. She squeezed her eyes shut, her face a mask of such profound, tragic suffering that it would have been comical if it hadn't been so utterly, monstrously false. "Oh, Mom," she moaned, her voice a weak, trembling whisper that was a perfect imitation of a person in the final, agonizing stages of a terminal illness. "I wish I could, I really truly wish I could, but my fibromyalgia, it's a raging fire today. The doctor said I can't risk lifting anything, not even a bag of groceries. And my back, the pain is just, it's unbearable. I can't even get off this couch. You have no idea what it's like to live with this kind of chronic invisible pain." She delivered the lines with the practiced, shameless conviction of a seasoned actress. Her performance a well-rehearsed symphony of sighs, groans, and pathetic, pleading glances. She had played this scene 1,000 times for 1,000 different doctors, and she was a master of her craft. I stood there leaning against the doorframe for support, my own real and increasingly dangerous illness, a mere footnote in the grand fraudulent opera of her imaginary one. There was no point in arguing. The wall of her performance was impenetrable. "I see," I said, my voice a flat, defeated whisper. "I'm sorry to have bothered you." I turned and walked away, her soft moaning sounds of agony following me down the stairs. An hour later, as I was trying to summon the strength to call a cab to take me to the clinic, I happened to glance out the small, grimy basement window that looked out onto the front driveway, and I saw her. I saw Kimberly. She was not on the sofa. She was not in the throes of a debilitating fibromyalgia flare-up. She was effortlessly and with a speed and efficiency that was almost athletic, hauling a dozen heavy bags of groceries from the trunk of her car. She was lifting, twisting, carrying, her movements fluid and strong, her face not a mask of agony but a picture of focused, competent energy. The theater was closed, the audience was gone, and the actress, in the privacy of her own driveway, had finally broken character. The sight of Kimberly, so strong and capable, so effortlessly performing the very tasks she had, just an hour before, claimed were a physical impossibility, was a new and particularly cruel kind of betrayal. It was not just a lie, it was a performance, a piece of theater staged for my benefit, designed to reinforce my own helplessness and her own tragic victimhood. The hypocrisy of it was so profound, so utterly shameless, that it left me feeling dizzy and disoriented. I was the one who was truly sick, my body in the grip of a real and worsening infection. But in the twisted, inverted reality of this household, my real illness was an inconvenience, while her fake one was a sacred, unassailable truth. I tried to push through the rest of the day, my fever climbing, my cough becoming a constant racking thing that left me breathless and exhausted. But by the next morning my body had staged a full-scale rebellion. I awoke in a pool of sweat, my sheets soaked, my body trembling with a fever so high that the world seemed to be shimmering at the edges. I tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness sent me crashing back onto my lumpy mattress. I was too weak to stand, too sick to even call for help. The bronchitis, as I had feared, had taken a dark, dangerous turn. I was no longer just sick, I was incapacitated. And with my incapacitation, the entire fragile and fraudulent system of the household collapsed. The unseen cog that kept the machine running had just broken, and the result was immediate and catastrophic chaos. I could hear it all from my basement room, a symphony of dysfunction playing out on the floor above me. I heard the children, Chloe and Aiden, their voices escalating from confused whimpers to full-blown frustrated wails. They were hungry, they were bored, they were unsupervised. I heard Kimberly, her voice not the weak, breathy moan of a chronic pain sufferer, but a sharp, shrill, and increasingly hysterical shriek. Aiden, stop that. Chloe, get down from there. Jason, do something. I heard Jason, his voice a low, sullen growl of a man who had been rudely awakened from his life of leisure. I'm trying, Kim. They won't listen to me. The house, which I had always kept in a state of quiet, orderly calm, was descending into a state of primal chaos. The children were unruly. The house was a mess. And my daughter and her husband, the two professional invalids, were being forced for the first time in years to confront the messy, inconvenient reality of their own lives, and they did not like it one bit. Their frustration, their rage at the disruption of their comfortable, parasitic existence, needed a target, and that target, of course, was me. I was the source of their inconvenience. My illness was not a medical crisis. It was a personal betrayal, a deliberate act of sabotage designed to ruin their day. The final, terrible act of this drama began in the late afternoon. I had managed to call a neighbor, a kind elderly woman named Mrs. Gable, and had asked her, my voice a hoarse, desperate whisper, if she could possibly pick up a prescription for me. I had called my doctor, described my symptoms, and he had without hesitation called in a prescription for a powerful antibiotic and a prescription-strength cough syrup. Mrs. Gable, a true angel of mercy, had dropped the small white paper bag on the front stoop, and I had heard Kim snatch it up a few minutes later. I lay in my bed, my body aching, my lungs burning, waiting for my daughter to bring me the medicine that I so desperately needed. Instead, she brought me a storm. The basement door was thrown open with a crash, and Kim stomped down the stairs, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. She was not performing now. This was not the tragic, long-suffering victim. This was the real Kimberly, a woman whose face was hard and cruel and utterly devoid of any compassion. She was holding the small white pharmacy bag in her hand. I have had it, Mom, she shrieked, her voice a raw, ugly thing. I have had it with you. I have had to spend the entire day taking care of my own children. Do you have any idea how exhausting that is? My back is killing me, and it's all your fault. You and your stupid, selfish sickness. I tried to speak, to defend myself, but a racking cough tore through my body, leaving me breathless and weak. She looked at the bag in her hand, at the life-saving medication it contained, and a new, even more terrifying look entered her eyes. It was a look of cold, calculating cruelty. You know, she said, her voice dropping to a low, venomous hiss. The deal was simple. You work, you get the benefits. You get a room, you get food. But you're not working, are you, Mom? You're just lying here being a useless, expensive burden. She opened the bag and pulled out the 2 bottles of medicine, the amber plastic of the antibiotic bottle and the dark, thick liquid of the cough syrup. She held them up, as if they were evidence in a trial. If you're not going to work, she said, her voice a chilling, almost playful whisper, then you don't get the benefits. And then, in an act of such monstrous cold-blooded cruelty that my mind could barely comprehend it. She turned and walked back up the stairs, taking my medicine with her. I lay there, helpless, paralyzed by a mixture of shock and terror, and I listened. I listened as I heard the sound of the kitchen faucet turning on, and I listened as I heard the sound of my daughter, my own flesh and blood, pouring my life-saving medication down the drain. The sound of the water running in the kitchen sink upstairs was the most terrifying sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of my own life being casually, contemptuously poured down the drain. I lay in my bed, my body a furnace of fever, my lungs a swamp of infection, and I listened to the gurgling final sound of my own potential salvation being washed away. The sheer, breathtaking cruelty of the act was a thing of monstrous, almost artistic perfection. It was not a crime of passion. It was a cold, calculated business decision. I was a broken piece of machinery no longer useful to the company, and my benefits had just been summarily terminated. A few moments later, Kim reappeared at the top of the stairs. She was no longer a whirlwind of rage. She was calm, her face a mask of cold, dispassionate finality. She had made her decision, and she was now simply executing the final logistical steps of my disposal. She walked down the stairs, a single black trash bag in her hand. She threw it on the foot of my bed. It landed with a soft, plastic sigh. "The deal was simple, Mom," she said, her voice as flat and as lifeless as a dial tone. "You provide the childcare, we provide the roof. It was a transaction, and you are no longer holding up your end of the bargain. If you can't work, you can't stay." Her words, so cold, so transactional, were a perfect, devastating summary of our entire relationship. I was not her mother, I was a service provider. And my service had been deemed unsatisfactory. "Pack your things," she said, her voice a final, irrevocable command. "I want you out in an hour." I looked past her to the figure standing in the shadows at the top of the stairs. It was Jason. He had been there the whole time. He had heard everything. He had watched his wife steal my medicine, and he had listened as she had thrown me out of his house. And he had said nothing. He just stood there, a silent, hulking silhouette, his arms crossed, his silence a clear and damning endorsement of his wife's actions. He was not just a bystander, he was a co-conspirator, a willing, silent partner in my destruction. The last flickering ember of hope inside me, the hope that some small, forgotten shred of human decency might still exist in that house, finally died, leaving nothing but cold, dead ash. I had no words left. There was nothing to say. I was a 64-year-old woman, sick with a serious respiratory infection, and I was being evicted by my own daughter with the silent, complicit approval of my son-in-law. Summoning a reserve of strength I did not know I possessed, I slowly, painfully began to move. My body was a traitor, my limbs heavy and uncooperative, my head a swirling fog of fever, but a new cold, hard fire was beginning to burn in my soul, a fire that was more powerful than any infection. It was the fire of pure, unadulterated survival. I stuffed my few pathetic belongings into the trash bag. A few changes of clothes, my well-worn Bible, the small framed photograph of my late husband that I kept on my nightstand. Every movement was an agony, every breath a sharp, stabbing pain, but I did not cry, I did not beg. I would not give them the satisfaction. When I was done, I dragged the heavy, lumpy bag up the stairs. Kim was waiting for me at the front door, her arms crossed, her face a mask of impatient, triumphant finality. She held the door open for me, a gesture of mock politeness that was more insulting than any curse. As I stumbled past her out into the cold, gray afternoon, she delivered her final parting shot. "Don't even think about trying to call social services," she hissed, her voice a low, venomous whisper. "It'll be your word against the word of a disabled woman and her disabled husband. Who do you think they're going to believe?" And then, she closed the door, the click of the lock a sound of absolute, irrevocable finality. I was out. My employment had been terminated, and my severance package was a single, black trash bag. I stood on the cold, cracked concrete of the sidewalk, the thin, damp Baltimore air a shock to my fevered lungs. The world seemed to be tilting and spinning, the familiar, row-house-lined street a blurry, hostile landscape. I was sick, I was homeless, and I was utterly, completely alone. The trash bag, with its pathetic collection of my life's remnants, was a heavy, clumsy anchor, tying me to this spot of profound, public humiliation. I had to move. I had to get away. I began to walk, my steps a slow, shuffling, agonizing journey to nowhere. Every breath was a struggle, a ragged, painful rasp that seemed to echo in the quiet afternoon air. The fever was a fire in my blood, making my vision swim and my legs feel like they were made of lead. I was a professional caregiver, a woman who had spent her life tending to the sick and the vulnerable. And now, in my own moment of profound medical need, I had been cast out, abandoned, my own life-saving medication poured down a drain. The sheer monstrous irony of it all was a bitter, metallic taste in the back of my throat. I made my way to a bus stop at the end of the block, the green bench a welcome, if unforgiving sight. I sank onto the cold hard plastic, my body trembling uncontrollably, a mixture of fever-induced chills and pure unadulterated shock. A bus arrived, its brakes hissing, its doors opening in a gesture of anonymous, mechanical welcome, but I couldn't get on. I had nowhere to go. The doors closed and the bus pulled away, leaving me alone again in a cloud of diesel fumes. The afternoon began to fade into a gloomy, premature twilight. The streetlights flickered on, their cold, artificial glow illuminating my small, pathetic island of despair. I felt a wave of fear so profound, so absolute, that it was a physical thing, a cold, heavy hand clutching at my heart. I was going to die. I was going to die, right here, on this bus stop bench. A sick, anonymous old woman, a casualty of my own daughter's monstrous casual cruelty. And then, through the fog of my fever and my fear, a single clear thought emerged. A name, a fate, a memory of a life before this one, a life that had contained warmth, and laughter, and loyalty. Valerie, my best friend, my sister in all but blood. We had been home health aides together for over 30 years, two soldiers in the quiet, unglamorous trenches of caregiving. She was a fighter, a sharp, no-nonsense woman, with a fierce sense of justice and a heart as big and as warm as the summer sun. Why hadn't I thought of her sooner? In the chaos and the trauma, I had forgotten that I was not entirely alone in the world. I still had family, real family. With a surge of renewed desperate hope, I fumbled in my purse for my phone. My fingers were clumsy and stiff with cold, but I managed to find her number in my contacts. I pressed the call button praying she would answer. She picked up on the second ring. "Patricia, is that you? I was just thinking about you. Is everything okay?" Her voice, so familiar, so strong, so wonderfully, blessedly normal, was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. And then, the dam inside me finally broke. The tears I had been unable to shed, the sobs that had been trapped in my burning chest, finally came, a torrent of grief and shame and rage. "Valerie," I sobbed, my voice a broken, unrecognizable croak. "I need you." I didn't have to say anything else. She didn't ask for an explanation. She just asked for a location. And then she said the 5 words that saved my life. "I'm on my way, honey." Valerie arrived less than 20 minutes later, her sensible sedan pulling up to the curb with a quiet, reassuring authority. She found me huddled on the bus stop bench, shivering uncontrollably, my face buried in my hands. She didn't say a word. She simply got out of the car, wrapped a thick warm blanket from her back seat around my shoulders and helped me to my feet, her arm a firm, steady anchor in the swirling chaos of my illness. She got me into the passenger seat, turned the heat up to full blast, and then without a single question she drove me home. Her home. A small, neat, and wonderfully warm apartment that was a sanctuary of peace and order. She led me to her comfortable sofa, wrapped me in more blankets, and then, with the practiced, no-nonsense efficiency of the professional caregiver she was, she took my temperature, she listened to my lungs with a stethoscope she still kept in her old medical bag, and she made me a cup of hot steaming tea with honey and lemon. She was not just my friend, she was my nurse, my advocate, my rescuer. As I slowly began to thaw, as the hot tea began to soothe the raw, ragged edges of my throat, she finally spoke. Her voice was quiet, but it was laced with an anger that was as cold and as hard as tempered steel. "Okay, Pat," she said, her eyes, which were usually so full of warmth and laughter, now dark with a righteous, protective fury. "You're safe now, you're warm, and now, you are going to tell me what that evil, good-for-nothing daughter of yours did to you." And so, the story came pouring out of me, a torrent of ugly, painful truths. I told her everything, the endless, unpaid labor, the fake disabilities, the cruelty, the lies. I told her about the groceries, about the collapse of the household, about the stolen medicine poured down the drain, and I told her about the final, brutal, transactional dismissal. "If you can't work, you can't stay." As I spoke, I watched a transformation occur in my friend's face. The initial horrified shock in her eyes slowly cooled, solidifying into something as hard and as unyielding as granite. Her sympathy, which had been a warm, comforting blanket, was now being forged into a weapon. When I finally fell silent, My story told, she didn't offer empty platitudes or comforting hugs. She reached out and took my hand, her grip firm and steady. "That woman," she said, her voice a low, dangerous growl, "is not your daughter. She is a monster. And that man she is married to is a coward and a thief. What they did to you is not just immoral, Pat, it's criminal." She stood up and began to pace her small, neat living room, her movements like those of a caged lioness. "Pouring your medication down the drain, that's not just cruelty, that's reckless endangerment. Kicking you out, a 64-year-old woman with a serious respiratory infection, that's elder abuse. And this whole disability scam, that's fraud. Straight up go to jail, federal fraud." She stopped pacing and looked at me, her eyes blazing with a fierce, cleansing fire. "We're not going to cry about this, Pat," she said, her voice a command. "We're going to fight. They wanted to treat you like an employee? Fine, we'll treat them like criminal. We are going to take every single dirty little secret they have, and we are going to expose it to the light of day." In that moment, her unvarnished, validating anger was the only medicine I needed. It was an antibiotic for my soul. It was burning away the infection of my own misplaced guilt, my own foolish sense of family loyalty. It was reminding me of the woman I used to be, the woman who fought for others, the woman who did not suffer fools or tolerate injustice. My daughter had thrown me out, but my friend, my sister had just welcomed me home, and from this safe, warm harbor, we were about to launch a storm that would sink their entire fraudulent enterprise. I spent the next 3 days in the quiet, healing sanctuary of Valerie's home. She nursed me back to health with a professional, no-nonsense tenderness that was a balm to my body and my soul. She made me chicken soup. She made sure I took the new course of antibiotics she had gotten from her own doctor. She let me sleep, a deep restorative sleep that was free from the oppressive, resentful atmosphere of my daughter's house. And as the fever in my body began to recede, the fire in my soul began to burn brighter. The fog of my grief and my shock was clearing, replaced by a cold, hard, and utterly focused resolve. Valerie and I talked for hours, or rather I talked, and she listened. For the first time in years, I had a safe space to speak the truth, to lay out the full, ugly, and unvarnished reality of the life I had been living. And with every word I spoke, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. I told her about the full, intricate anatomy of their fraud. As a former home health aide, I had been a silent, unwilling witness to the master class in deception they were performing every single day. I described, in the precise clinical detail of a medical professional, the way Kimberly would prepare for a doctor's visit. She would spend the day before in bed, deliberately stiffening her muscles, practicing her pained expressions in a mirror. She had a whole wardrobe of sick clothes, drab, ill-fitting garments that made her look frail and pathetic. She had a library of medical textbooks, and she would study the symptoms of fibromyalgia, of chronic fatigue syndrome, of a dozen other invisible illnesses, memorizing the language of pain, the specific subjective complaints that no doctor could definitively disprove. I told Valerie about Jason's scam, which was cruder but no less effective. He had a network of other construction workers, a whole underground economy of cash-in-hand jobs that left no paper trail. I had seen him come home at the end of the day, his body tired and sore from a full day of real physical labor, only to collapse onto the sofa and begin moaning about the phantom pains from his old work-related injury. He would meticulously document every ache, every twinge in a small black notebook, a fraudulent diary of a pain that did not exist, all for the benefit of the federal disability auditors. I had seen their bank statements, which I had to sort through as part of my unpaid housekeeping duties. I had seen the regular monthly deposits from the Social Security Administration and the Maryland Department of Labor, a steady, reliable stream of taxpayer money that funded their life of leisure. And I had seen the other side of the ledger, the cash withdrawals, the lavish, unexplained spending, the complete and total absence of any legitimate declared income from Jason. They were not just cheating the system, they were masters of it. They were two professional con artists, and their greatest, most successful con was the performance of their own tragic victimhood. As I laid out the full, sordid details, I saw Valerie's expression of sympathetic anger harden into one of cold, professional fury. She was not just my friend, listening to a story of personal betrayal. She was a fellow caregiver, a woman who had spent her life in the service of the genuinely sick and the truly vulnerable. And what my daughter and her husband were doing was a profound personal insult to everything she had ever worked for. It was a desecration of the very idea of compassion. "They are stealing," she said, her voice a low, dangerous growl. "They are stealing from the people who actually need it. They are stealing from the old, from the sick, from the truly disabled. They are stealing from people like us, Pat, from the taxpayers who funded that system with a lifetime of hard work. She was right, and in that moment, my own personal sense of betrayal, my own private pain began to expand, to connect to something larger. This was not just about me anymore. This was not about a mother and a daughter. This was about justice. It was about accountability. It was about the fundamental moral difference between right and wrong. Valerie, with her sharp, pragmatic and fiercely logical mind, helped me to see the path forward. You can't think of this as revenge, Pat, she said, her voice firm and clear. Revenge is emotional. It's messy. This is not about emotion. This is about civic duty. You have been a witness to a long-term systematic fraud against the government. You have a moral and, I would argue, a legal obligation to report it. She was giving me a new framework, a new language to understand my own power. I was not a scorned mother, seeking to punish her ungrateful children. I was a citizen, a whistleblower, a witness for the prosecution. The shift in perspective was profound. It was empowering. It took the messy, painful tangle of my own emotions, and it straightened it into a clean, clear, and righteous path of action. The next morning, I was a new woman. The fever was gone. The cough had subsided, and in their place was a cold, hard, and unshakable resolve. With Valerie sitting beside me, a silent, supportive presence, I picked up the phone. I did not call my daughter. I did not call my son-in-law. I made a series of official and utterly devastating phone calls. My first call was to the Fraud Investigation Unit of the Social Security Administration. My second was to the Office of the Inspector General for the U.S. Department of Labor. And my final call was to the Fraud Hotline for the Maryland Department of Labor. At each number, I was connected with a calm, professional, and very interested agent, and to each one I told my story. Not the emotional story of a mother's betrayal, but the cold, hard, factual story of a long-term systematic fraud. I gave them names. I gave them dates. I gave them address. I described in the precise clinical detail of a home health aide, the exact nature of their fake disabilities, and the reality of their able-bodied lives. I was a calm, credible, and devastatingly well-informed witness, and with every word I spoke, I could feel the invisible net of justice, a net that I had just cast, beginning to tighten around the two people who had so foolishly and so cruelly underestimated me. The days that followed were a strange, quiet, and intensely nerve-wracking period of waiting. I had lit the fuse, and now, all I could do was wait for the explosion. I stayed with Valerie in the quiet, peaceful sanctuary of her home, and I slowly began to piece my own life back together. I opened a new bank account. I got a new phone number. I began to look at small, affordable apartments for seniors, the kind of quiet, respectable places I should have been living in all along. But beneath the surface of my new quiet routine, my mind was a whirlwind of anxious speculation. Had they believed me? Were they investigating? Or had my tip, my one desperate act of rebellion, simply disappeared into the vast, indifferent maw of government bureaucracy? I had no way of knowing. The agencies I had contacted were by necessity secretive. They would not, and could not, give me an update on an active investigation. And so, I waited. I imagined the invisible net, the one I had cast with my phone calls, slowly, silently, tightening around Kim and Jason's comfortable, fraudulent little world. I imagined unmarked cars, parked at the end of their street, their occupants documenting Jason's daily miraculous recoveries as he left for his under-the-table job. I imagined investigators poring over their bank records, tracing the patterns of their undeclared income and their lavish, inexplicable spending. I imagined them interviewing our old neighbors, the ones who had undoubtedly seen Kim, in the throes of her debilitating fibromyalgia, effortlessly carrying heavy bags of groceries or chasing after the children in the park. The investigation, I knew, would be a slow, methodical, and utterly relentless process. The government, when it chooses to move, moves with the slow, crushing, and irresistible force of a glacier. And my tip, with its specific, credible, and insider details, would have been the catalyst that set that glacier in motion. I thought about Kim and Jason, blissfully unaware, living their lives of leisure, their days a comfortable, predictable rhythm of fake pain and real television. They would have noticed my absence. Of course, the house would be a mess. The children would be unruly. Their lives would have been inconvenienced, but they would have seen it as a temporary problem, a logistical challenge to be solved. They would have been annoyed, enraged even, but they would not have been scared. They were too arrogant, too confident in the perfection of their own, long-running con to ever imagine that their world was about to be utterly, completely, and irrevocably destroyed. They had thrown me out, they had solved the immediate problem of my inconvenient illness. And they would have assumed, with the breathtaking, sociopathic arrogance that was their hallmark, that that was the end of it. They had no idea that it was just the beginning. The call came on a Tuesday morning, exactly 3 weeks after I had been thrown out of their house. It was an unknown number, but my heart, with a kind of primal instinctual certainty, knew who it was. I let it ring 4 times, my hand hovering over the phone, a small cold smile on my lips. Then, I answered. "Hello?" I said, my voice calm, cool, and utterly unrecognizable as the weak, pleading woman I had been just a few weeks before. It was Jason, and he was not the calm, sullen, and silently complicit man I had known. He was a babbling, incoherent, and utterly terrified wreck. "Patricia," he stammered, his voice a high-pitched, panicked squeal that was almost comical. "Patricia, thank God. I've been trying to call Kim's old number for you for days." Of course he had. He had been trying to call the daughter, the abuser, not the mother, the victim. A small but telling detail. "What is it, Jason?" I asked, my voice a cool, dispassionate inquiry. It's a disaster," he wailed, his voice cracking with a hysterical sobbing fear. "The government, Patricia, they're all over us. We got a letter this morning, from the Social Security Administration. They're cutting off Kim's benefits. They say they have evidence that she's not really sick. And me, they froze our bank accounts. All of them. They say I've been committing tax fraud. They're talking about jail time, Patricia. Jail time. They're going to take our house. They're going to take the kids." He paused, his breath coming in great, gulping, panicked sobs. I remained silent, a quiet, dispassionate observer of the beautiful, spectacular implosion of his life. And then he delivered the line I had been waiting for, the pathetic, desperate plea of a cornered, terrified rat. "Patricia, what did you do?" he begged, his voice a pathetic whining thing. "You have to call them. You have to tell them it was all a mistake, a misunderstanding. We'll do anything. You can come back, we'll take care of you. I swear. Just, please. You have to fix this." It was a stunning, breathtaking display of pure, unadulterated, and utterly shameless self-interest. He was not apologizing, he was not expressing a single solitary shred of remorse for his own monstrous behavior. He was simply trying to undo the consequences. He saw me not as a human being he had wronged, but as a tool, a switch that could be flipped to turn off the terrible, inconvenient machine of justice that was now grinding his life into dust. He wanted me to lie for him. He wanted me to become a participant in his fraud, to save him from the consequences of his own criminal actions. The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of it all was a thing of monstrous, almost artistic perfection. I let him babble on for another minute, his pleas becoming more desperate, more pathetic, more incoherent. I listened, my face a mask of calm, dispassionate neutrality, and then, when he had finally exhausted himself, when his sobs had subsided into a series of small, pathetic, hiccuping gasps, I spoke. My voice was not angry, it was not triumphant. It was the calm, quiet, and utterly final voice of a nurse, delivering a terminal diagnosis. "You told me if I couldn't work, I couldn't stay, Jason," I said, my voice a cool, clear, and utterly unforgiving statement of fact. "It seems the government has the same policy for you and Kim. If you can work, you can't stay on disability." The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. It was a silence so profound, so complete, that I could almost hear the sound of his small, selfish, and utterly ruined world collapsing into a black hole of his own making. I did not wait for a reply. There was nothing more to say. I had delivered my final clinical diagnosis. And then, with a sense of peace so profound, so absolute, that it was almost a physical sensation, I hung up the phone. My justice had been served, not in a shout, but in a quiet, irrefutable, and beautifully symmetrical truth. Now I'm curious about you who have listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever had to choose between turning a blind eye and demanding accountability? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching.